Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on Community Right to Buy. With us, we have Dave Thompson, who's the head of the Community Land Team at the Scottish Government, who has kindly agreed to talk about Community Right to Buy. My name is Ailey Todd from Highlands Enterprise, and I'll be taking you through a little bit of an introduction, and then I'm going to hand over to Dave for the real nitty-gritty. Just to note that Community Right to Buy is one of a number of routes to ownership, and though that is what the sole focus of this webinar is, there are other routes. In fact, on the right of your screen, there's actually 4 handouts, which are route maps to negotiated sales, Community Right to Buy, which we're talking about today, Crofting Community Right to Buy, which is for communities who are interested in acquiring land under crofting tenure, and Asset Transfer, which is for communities who are interested in leasing or buying assets that are publicly owned. The Community Right to Buy has been strengthened recently to make it more workable for communities. Amongst other improvements, it also extends to all communities, including urban and rural communities. So as I said, we have Dave Thompson from the Community Land Team, who, well, I'm sure will want to do his own introductions. There's a question and answer box on your right-hand side of your screen. If you have any questions, please do pop them in there, and we'll do a wee question and answer session at the end. Right, I will just hand over to Dave now.
Okay, thank you, Ailey. Good morning, everybody. As Ailey said, my name is Dave Thompson, and I'm head of the Community Land Team within the Scottish Government, based in Edinburgh. And amongst other things, the team is responsible for all the various community rights to buy. Essentially, the Community Right to Buy, as Ailey said, is one of a number of routes, and we're just going to talk through this particular one today. So, first of all, what is Community Right to Buy? As Ailey quite said, it's one of many tools that allow communities to purchase land, a number of different ways. There's asset transfer, the rights to buy, and negotiated sale, all the handouts you've got on your right-hand side there. But today, we're just going to cover the Community Right to Buy, or Part 2, as we call it. Part 2 refers to the fact that it's Part 2 of the Land Reform Act 2003. Just for information, the other parts, Part 1 is about access rights, and Part 3 is the Crofting Community Right to Buy. The Act was amended in several ways in April last year, one of which was what we call in that class is the major change, which is to allow urban communities the opportunity to use the right to buy. Until April last year, it was only available to rural communities. And what it is, it gives the communities the chance to buy assets, and that's land or buildings and fishing rights, etc., for those of you in the middle of Glasgow that need to salmon fish. And it's if the owner decides to sell, and it gives the community the right to buy that before anyone else has the opportunity. However, it's in this sort of talk today, it's also quite important to say what it's not for. What it's not is a for sale of land or a compulsory purchase. It is a registration of interest, which, if the owner decides to sell, gives the group the first chance to buy that. It shouldn't be used as a means to block or blight development. The right is there to allow communities to get ownership of land, to empower the community, give them control over the future of their own community. It's not a tool to block development. If you do have a successful registration in place as a community group, that registration does not prevent the owner from developing or even leasing that land or asset, but it does prevent them from taking any further steps to then sell that asset. Equally, it shouldn't be used to block another interested party from purchasing the land. It is there, it's important to remember, it's there for the community group to develop the asset for the future of that community. If someone else is going to develop something which is for the benefit of the community, they should be allowed to do so. But if the community have the right, then equally they should do. The registration itself is not meant to preserve the status quo. Now, by that I mean it's not a tool for a community group just to keep things exactly as they are. One of the main examples you have to give in the application is that it has to be sustainably developed. Now, by developed, if it's in status quo, then obviously you're not developing anything. Communities should have some sort of plans on how they want to improve the asset in some way or another, even if it's to replace it with something else, but it needs to make an improvement and to give a benefit back to the community, not just keep things as they are. So there's basically any land in Scotland now is eligible for the community right to buy. As we said earlier, it was previously just rural, but now it's open to anywhere in Scotland. And as you can see there, that includes foreshore mills, salmon fishing rights, any number of land or assets can and have been purchased in the past by communities. It's against any landowner. Ailey touched on asset transfer earlier, which is for land owned by public bodies. The community right to buy can equally be used against public bodies as well. It's another tool, but this one importantly can be used against private owners. And in theory, that does mean other community owners, although we would probably question whether that's quite in the public interest that one community is buying it from the other community. But in theory, it's any landowner at all. Now, the community themselves must have some sort of connection with the land. Now, it says there we've got adjacent to or within the community. It can be a little distance away, but the idea is that if you're situated in Glasgow, you shouldn't have the right to buy over land up in the northeast of Scotland. So we want the communities to demonstrate some sort of connection with that land. It doesn't necessarily mean that you currently have use of it or it's accessible by the community, because in a lot of cases that's not the situation, and by opening up that access or use of the land is the benefit and the sustainable development we've talked to. But you must demonstrate that it has some sort of a connection with the community. Now, I've been talking about communities, and basically we allow communities to define themselves, but we do have a set of constraints which you have to meet in terms of that. But in this context, there are several. Again, one of the changes that came in April was that we widened the number of ways in which a community can define themselves. At the heart of it all, it's still basically about sort of postcode and postcode areas, but all of them are based on a geographic definition. And what that does mean is that for community right to buy, communities of interest can access the right to buy. So for example, a book club can't use the right to buy. However, if the book club has a geographic situation, it's only for people within a certain community, they can define themselves by that geographic one. The different ways you can define yourself geographically: you've got electoral ward, community council area, postcode area, so for example EH, but as you can see from the map on the right, that might be slightly large in certain places. In fact, in all places it will be slightly large, but what you can do is you can go further to EH99, or down to the postcode sector, or even right down to the postcode unit. And just for anybody who doesn't know, that address is the Scottish Parliament. You can define yourself by an island, if that's easier for you to do so, or through the GRO, the General Register's Office, definitions that they use in the likes of the census: a settlement, for example Falkirk there, or locality, which is within a settlement. So you've got a number of these different ways you can define yourself geographically, and you're more than welcome to use any or a mixture of those. You don't have to restrict yourself to one in particular. What we do say though is that when you define yourself geographically, you should make sure you are inclusive. What that basically means is that you can't, for example, take a range of postcodes and miss one street out or one group of houses out that may not agree with what you want to do, so you don't include them in it. They have to be inclusive, but equally, you shouldn't necessarily want to include everybody who might possibly use that asset. At the end of the day, you have to keep your community a manageable size for processes later on in the community right to buy, like the ballot, for example. So it's important to have a think about what does your community mean to you. It could be as small as a postcode unit, and especially in some of the smaller places, and equally within a large city, it might be more manageable. One postcode unit could still have quite a few people within that community, but it's more likely to be a combination of 2 or 3 or more of those postcode units. So that's what I mean by you can actually mix and match these areas to suit. Now, the group themselves have to be structured in some way, and now there are 3 different options open. It was just previously 1. What you can be is you can be a company limited by guarantee, which is the most popular, but that's probably mostly because it was the only option open until April. And these themselves are regulated by Companies House and will follow company law. You can also be a SCIO, which stands for Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisation, and these are regulated by OSCR, which is the Office of Scottish Charities Regulator, who are based in Dundee. Or you can be a community benefit company, or BENCOM, and these are regulated by the Financial Conduct Authority. They're all largely similar, and to be honest, I'm not sure of what the exact differences between them are, but it's important to maybe talk to your advisor and see what's most useful to you. As I said earlier, the company limited guarantee has been the most popular, but the SCIOs are starting to become more popular as an option for groups. So they're all fairly similar, so pick the one that's best for you. But what they do all have in common is that the company themselves, whatever format you decide to take, they must be run for the benefit of the community. And that means they're not run for the individual members or for individuals themselves, so nobody gets share capital out of it or anything like that. You can use community shares, but that's a different type of fundraising. But any benefit that comes out of that company, and that does include profits, has to go back into that community. It's not for the individual members of the company, it's for the community. It must be open to all. You can't say it's only open to members of a particular club or of a particular type. It must be open to the whole community that you defined earlier in your geographic sense. It should be run by the community. That means that the members of the board, and the majority of the members of the boards, have to be from within that community. It's 75% at the moment. And that is to prevent community groups and the company that was formed to morph into being run from several miles away, another city even. It needs to remain in control of the community, and that's important to us, so that when a community gets an asset, that it stays within that community to run, to manage, to gain profit from, to gain benefit from. So in that way, it still needs to be run by the community. And as I touched on earlier, it has to be consistent with furthering sustainable development. Now, sustainable development is a very wide term, and in simple terms, it is what you want it to be. In your application form, we will ask you to tell us why your plans are, sustainably development. And that can be anything from it prevents an eyesore from falling down, and we will then develop that building and use it as a community hub, or bring it back into use as an old cinema, or whatever the previous use was. It can be a community garden with information panels which will benefit the health and well-being of the community as a result, removing a blight site. It can be affordable housing. It can be anything you want it to be, and believe me, there are a lot of different options that communities have used in the past and will continue to use in the future. But the key is it has to be sustainably developed. In other words, it has to be there for the benefit of future generations as well, not just for the current one, and it's not just a one-off. And as I touched on, you have to be registered with one of these organisations, depending on what sort of structure you decided to have as your group structure, and any one of them is perfectly fine with us. Now, we do have various templates that you can use to help form your community group, picking whatever one you type. If you go by Companies Limited Guarantee, you will then get a company number, certificate of incorporation. That essentially sets you up as a formal group or structure of that type. Some of the things that each of them has, they'll have slightly different requirements depending on which you go for. In the likes of Companies House or your high advisor or us will be able to tell you some of those requirements. But one of the ones that goes across all of it is some form of governing documents. That's essentially saying how your community group will be run, who's in charge, how often you have AGMs, how often members are elected, all sorts of rules, what you do with the assets, what happens to the profits, And every type of company has to have some form of governing documents. We've got templates for each of the types, so feel free to ask us, and again, I'm sure your high advisor will have availability of those as well and be able to put you in touch with more of those. If you decide to go down the SKIO route, or even if you're a company with charitable purposes, it's quite important just to have a quick chat with Oscar themselves. They're very helpful in these regards. The templates we have been developed in conjunction with Oscar, so they're perfectly compliant with both sides of the things, but it's important to talk to Oscar if you've got charitable purposes, just to make sure that they do meet their requirements for a charitable purpose, for example. And they will go back and forward and make sure and help you develop those to make sure that they are okay as far as Oscar are concerned. And equally, you can quite happily talk to our team or your high advisor about getting your governing documents just right. They need to be compliant with the Land Reform Act if you're using community right to buy. Now, the requirements, for example, for a company limited with guarantee that Companies House have are slightly different from ours, because ours have some little additional elements about, for example, ensuring that it stays community owned and community run. Again, our templates have been developed to make sure that when you fill the template in, that will then comply with both Companies House and the Land Reform Act, or with Oscar and the Land Reform Act. What the community land team here are always happy to do, and do quite often, is we will go through drafts with you. We're quite happy to go back and forth as many times as it takes to ensure that the drafts that you have are compliant with the Act and that you've not missed out bits, because what we don't want is groups to come in with an application and simply to get knocked out because of a technicality. That's not to say that when we've looked at your drafts, gone back and forwards and said your draft's okay, that's not making any sort of decision on your application, but what it is just ensuring that it's compliant with the Act, and we can then consider the content of it, you know, your business plans and your sustainable development and things like that, rather than, oh, you've missed out section 4, therefore you're rejected. So it's just to make sure that when you do come to us as a proper application and a compliant application, that's as good as it can be at that point in time. Once you have a set of compliant documents and your Articles of Association are all correct and compliant with the Act, we will send you a letter of compliance, what we sometimes refer to as a Section 34 letter. That essentially says that this community group has now been formed in a format that is compliant with the Land Reform Act. You cannot access or use the community right to buy until you have that letter. That's very important in that one. So once we send you that letter, you're then eligible to put in a full application for right to buy. On the application itself, now that we've got to that stage, you've formed your company, you've defined your community, and you've formed your company into whatever type you feel best for you, you can submit your application. There are two broad types of application. There's Timaeus, which is where no steps have been taken to transfer the land by the current owner. That's our preferred one, but we obviously recognise that that is not always the case, and in some cases it's impossible. So henceforth we've got late applications, and this is where steps have been taken to transfer the land. Now, the steps to transfer the land don't necessarily have to be putting on the market. It can include things like negotiations or processes that public bodies have to go through, like internal trawls. Quite often we find community groups are not aware of these because, for example, obviously if it's an internal trawl, you wouldn't be aware of it. But we still give you a chance to come in with an application even though those processes have started. As I said, the Timaeus ones is what we prefer, because what we'd prefer community groups to do is to have a think about what it is your community needs, what sort of things would help your community to grow, to thrive, and what asset might you need to do that. And if you can ever think of that in advance and say, well, we need, you know, such and such a piece of land, a particular size to build, you know, a new hall or whatever, then that's you already on the road of saying, well, we've identified that and there's land around our community and within our community that's possible for that, so we can put a registration on that. And as I say, a registration is just that. It's a registration of interest. It's not a blocking system. It's not a means to force the owner to sell, and should never be seen as such. It's simply you saying, we need an area of land or an asset or a building to do a set of things which will benefit the community, and we've identified this one here as a potential one. And that is simply what it's for. The late one, the registration interest and process, the way it goes is essentially you submit an application to us. And again, we are more than happy to look at drafts of that application, again, so they're not rejected on technicality. Once we've received that application, as I said before, we won't be able to tell you if you're going to be successful, but what we can tell you is a compliant application. The reason that we don't want groups to get knocked out on technicalities is when we receive an application, as soon as we get it, obviously it goes out to the owner themselves and to any other interested parties if they've got any creditors or anything which have holds over the land or whatever. They all get a copy of your application. As soon as that application is received by us, we also write out to Registers of Scotland. And what happens is that a prohibition is placed on that asset. And that prohibition prevents the owner from taking any steps or taking further steps that they've already started to transfer that land. So they have to stop any negotiations, they have to stop any sale, even if it's on the market, but it still doesn't prevent development or leasing. So just because a prohibition is in place, they can still continue to develop that land. So this is why it's not used to stop development, because that development can still continue. Once we send that out to the owner or the creditor, they have a chance to provide comments on the application. Now those comments are, and in the past we've seen those, many and varied. Sometimes this is the first the owner's heard of it. If, for example, you're not entirely sure who the owner is and you've just looked it up on the Register of Scotland's website and you've got a name, that may sometimes be the first time, particularly if it's a company that owns it. But quite often, it's a chance for the owner to see what your plans are in full and to comment on them, both positively and negative. I mean, we do see both. It's not as if the owner always has negative comments. Quite often they have positive comments which support what the group wants to do. And that's always a good thing for us to see that, I have to say. So by all means, talk to the owner before you put the application on. And I would advise that in every case anyway, because it just makes the whole process that bit smoother. And they also give a chance for the owner to correct any misunderstandings about even ownership. Well, it's not actually me that owns it, it's my brother, it's just in my name, or particularly it's companies, well, it's not this company, it's a subsidiary company. It gives them a chance to correct those errors, and we can go back and forward and make sure that that's right. Of course, it's only equally fair that the community body are then given a chance to respond to what the owner said. So these processes take a little bit of time, and what we essentially do is we give the owner 3 weeks to come back with comments. We then give the community body 3 weeks to respond to those comments. Now these are the upper end of the scale. It can be quicker if you wish. And then the ministers have 3 weeks to make the decision. So overall it's 63 days at that point from when we receive your compliant application through to giving you a decision. We can take longer than that. And have done in a few cases because of the complexity of the case. There's a lot of things you have to consider and balancing things up and make sure everything's right and checking the owners are okay and that they are absolutely correct. So if we do go over that 63 days, it's important to know that it doesn't affect the community's rights, it doesn't affect anything further on down the process, there's no shortened timescales for the rest of it because of that. It's simply that we have a deadline to meet, and we will meet that in the majority of cases, but we sometimes do have to go beyond that. For late applications, that's a somewhat shortened timescale, simply because we are now interfering in a live land market. It could be the owner has already marketed the land, it could be they're in the middle of negotiations for transferring the land, or asset I should say. When I say land, I do refer to land and buildings. So it's about not delaying that process as little as possible. It's about trying to keep that process moving if at all possible, and yet still giving the community a chance to be involved in that and basically say, hey, look, we would like to buy that. as you can see, it's down to 30 days. The difference between it is that in a late application, the community body aren't given the opportunity to respond to the owner's views. So basically, we'll get the application sent out to the owner who has the 3 weeks. It comes back to us, we then have 9 days to make the decision. As you can see there, if it is complex, we can go out to either the community group or the owner to ask for further information, and then that's 7 days for us to go out, 7 days for the answer to come back. So it can be extended out to 44 days. And to be fair, if an owner was in the middle of selling land, that 44 days is to them quite a significant delay. As far as we're concerned, it's as short as we can keep it and yet still give all sides an opportunity to input into the process and for us to make a properly informed decision. After all of the decision, whether we decide to accept the application or reject it, the community body or the landowner can appeal that decision at the local sheriff court. And we've had appeals on both sides of the house, from the owner appealing the fact that we allowed the registration and from community groups appealing the fact that we didn't. And that's perfectly fine. Probably the important thing to note about that appeal is that the courts don't necessarily look at the decision as a case of whether the decision was right or wrong, because that is still a decision for Scottish ministers to make. What they look at is, was the decision made in the right way? Did we take into account all the information? Did we get the balance right in public interest and things? So it's not whether or not the decision was right or wrong, it's whether it was made in the right way or not. And we have been found in both ways, and that's perfectly fine. In one situation, it was found against us, and we recognised it was a fault with the legislation, so we made a change to the legislation. So it's important that if you do feel the decision went against you and we didn't make it correctly, then that option is open to you or owners. Now, for late applications, because they're interfering in this live market, as it were, there are some additional criteria that you would have to make, or more stringent tests, if you like, for a late application as compared to a Timaeus one. The main two demonstrations of any application when you send them in are essentially that you have the support of the community and that your plans for the asset are in the public interest and are sustainably developed. Now, normally for a Timaeus application, we'll ask for a demonstration of support of about 10% of your community, and remember that community is that geographic one that you defined earlier. That demonstration is usually done by means of a petition, and it's important to note that as yet we can't allow online petitions, because what we have to check is that the people on that petition list are within the community, and in some cases even real people. So all the Donald Ducks and Mickey Mouses and all the rest of it are taken out, and we assess the community in the list that you give us against things like the voters roll to make sure that they do live in the community, they are real people. For a late application, we look for that to be about 15% or above. We do have some leeway to go below that, but that's generally the sort of threshold that we look at this stage. You have to show for a late application that you have done relevant work or steps prior to the owner taking steps to transfer that land. Previously, you had to have already been in the process of submitting an application to be able to put a late application. That was another change that was made in April, which allows you to demonstrate, well, although we didn't actually start to submit an application, we have done some work in getting towards that stage. That work doesn't necessarily, as I say, have to actually be to do with submitting an application itself, but it does have to be related to that. So you can't just say, oh, well, we had a meeting and we had a chat and it came up, but we didn't decide what to do with it. That's not necessarily relevant work or steps. What we're looking for is a demonstration of, well, we had a public meeting and we talked about purchasing that asset, and then we had a discussion about what we might do with that asset. That can count as relevant because you're actually looking at purchasing the asset itself. You have to include a timeline, because what we need to see is that that work was done at a point in time which was before the owner started their process. Unfortunately, we still can't allow a late application at which you have done no work before the owner has taken steps. That might seem a little unfair in terms of sometimes you just won't know until it's all, almost been and gone. It's almost concluded at that point. But we do have to give some recognition that this is a live market. So whilst we don't necessarily need to see an application before time, you need to show us what work you've done in that. And to do that, you include your timeline. And that's quite important to show. That's when we started discussing about the opportunity to buy this. Doesn't matter if at that point you didn't know the owner was selling it or in the process of selling it, as long as you can demonstrate you started that work before then. To back up your application, the rest of the things that an application needs are things like supporting documents, and that's your maps, demonstration of support, your constitution, which you've already worked on with us. Show that you've checked it's the correct owner, because it has to be the correct owner. You can't put one in against, you think it's so-and-so, but you're not entirely sure. It's up to you to check who the owner actually is. Now, all of those supporting documents will come in as part of the application, and again, the team are more than happy to work through that. We need to know what your connection with the land is, and again, if it's not immediately obvious, i.e. it's in the middle of the community, if it's slightly to the side, you have to tell why you think that land has got a connection with your community or why it can have that connection. We need to know what you want to do with the land. We don't need fully worked up business plans at this point. All we need is an idea that what you're trying to do is going to be sustainable and it's in the public interest. Now that public interest, again, like sustainable development, can be what you want it to be. The important thing to remember is that it's the wider public interest that we take into account as well. So it's not just the interest of the community group or the interest of that particular town, village, whatever. The wider public interest does get taken into account. And just how much of that gets taken into account depends on the project itself. A smaller scale one, we don't need to know the national public interest, but if it's a wider one, an old power station or an old bombing range for the MOD, there might be some wider considerations that we have to take into account. And essentially, public interest is a balancing act between those competing interests, and that's what we take into account as part of the process. And that really is it. That takes you up to the point at which you have an application. If it's successful, you've now got a registration on that asset or land. That registration will remain for 5 years. After 4 years, we'll send you a reminder if you need to re-register, because keep in mind, this is only a registration of interest should the owner decide to sell. So if the owner doesn't sell for 4 or 5 years, your registration remains. We'll contact you a year before it closes to ask you if you want to re-register. When you do re-register, all we'll ask you to demonstrate is that you still have community support and that your plans haven't changed. You haven't decided on a different area, or that the owner hasn't changed. If the owner has changed, then we will check and see whether that was actually allowed, because you still had that prohibition in place. That remains for the whole of that 5 years. There are some exempt transfers, for example, transfers between groups of companies within the same company, and also transfers to do with wills and estates and things like that. But essentially, they should not do any form of transfer, so the owner shouldn't change. But in some circumstances it may. So at the end of that 5 years, we just check everything's okay with that. We don't ask you to resubmit business plans or put in a new application. We try and keep that as simple as possible. And that really covers you up to that point. I think that's about as much as we're going to cover for today, and I'll hand back to Ailey for the final part of the session.
Thank you very much, Dave. That was certainly really informative, quite a lot of information there. What I'll do, I'll leave your screen up, because that's a really helpful slide, I think, with the contact details if people have questions. And I'll actually open the floor to the question and answer session. Attendees, please do use the question box on the right-hand side. We've had a couple of questions through already. The first one is to do with what form you have to take, and it's from Tristan, who says, can you be a community interest company?
Not at the moment, no. It's still those three. Although community interest companies were mentioned when we were making the changes to the Act as the bill went through, it was felt we didn't have enough examples of where that would be of benefit compared to the other ones. That's not to say that we can't be added in at a later time, because we have left room in the legislation to allow us to do that as different types of groups come about. But at the moment, it's still those three, which is company limited with guarantee, the SKIO or the BENCOM.
Okay, that's a pretty definite answer. I've got another question here. What would you say is the most common mistake a community group would make in this process?
Probably the wrong owner. We accept that sometimes trying to find the correct owner is not always easy, particularly if it's a company that owns the asset. But it's important to go through the proper checks for the likes of Registers of Scotland to make sure you identify the correct owner, because no matter how hard it is to find one, to serve a prohibition, we have to serve it on somebody, and therefore we need the right owner. And if you do have a successful registration and go to buy it, you've got to buy it from somebody, and that has to be the right person. What I would say in that one though is that if it's impossible for you to find the owner for the registration stage, and the registration stage only, not the purchase, you are allowed to register an interest without knowing the owner, but we have to be confident that the owner cannot be found. And what you do is you essentially put a notice on the land for 2 weeks to say, you know, we are about to register an interest on this land. That, in our eyes, gives the owner a chance to see that notice and get in touch. But when it comes to purchase, you still have to find the owner. So I would say that's probably the most common mistake.
Okay, so top tip is try very hard to find your owner.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. We've got a question in from Gordon Thompson, which is, how is the property value established? For example, if the community values the property at £100,000 and the owner believes it should sell for £150,000, how is that situation dealt with?
Right, the value of the property, and it may seem as a little blasé statement, but at this stage is not that relevant to us for the registration stage. Obviously in the purchase stage it is, and what we do is if the right to buy is triggered and the owner says, I'm going to sell this, the registration's in place so the community get first chance. What we do is we will send out the district valuer. We have a contract with the district valuer, and they will give us an independent assessment of the value of the property. So that doesn't include things like hope value, which quite often owners will have. You know, they hope that they'll get planning permission to put several houses on it, so the value is going through the roof. And the community quite obviously want it valued as low as they possibly can to be able to afford to buy it. Now, the district valuer will take into account what they do, what we call a red book valuation, which is a full valuation. It's not just a drive by or a walk past. They go on site, they do the full investigation of the property, and they will give us the value. That's not to say that the owner and the community can't come to some agreement about what they will pay for that. But if the owner is sticking to the guns and valuing it way above that, we take the district valuer as the upper limit of the value of the property.
Okie doke. And when it comes to buying the property, if it's a significant time later, it's a reminder that you might actually need a new valuation at that point as well.
We'll trigger the valuation once the sale's triggered, yeah.
Yeah. We've talked quite a lot about the timeline, and we've got a question in from Amanda who's asking, does the timeline require hard evidence, or can it just be a note of visits/chats to the owner?
It can just be a note of it, but obviously it has to be dated. We'll look at everything we've got. I mean, if you say you had a meeting with the owner on the 3rd of February at 10 o'clock in the morning, and that's what you have a note of that, and you show us the letter you sent out or the email you sent to people to make sure they got there on time, we'll take that as evidence. The owner comes back and shows us evidence that they were in London that day, for example, then say, well, who did you talk to that day? But yeah, it's some form of documentary evidence, not just verbal.
Okay, so definitely have some form of documentation. Would renovating or restoring a formal landfill site/quarry be counted as within the wider public interest? And that's from Christina.
It certainly could be, and I'd be hard pushed to figure out where the public interest in leaving the quarry as it was, unless it was actually a viable, usable quarry. But you have to say what you're going to do, you know, with that filled in. I mean, I think we've got one that's talking to us about using a quarry as a water park, because it's got a pool in the bottom of it. So you don't necessarily have to fill it in. But yeah, I mean, if filling it in and then building on top of it or developing it in some other ways is what you want to do with it, and that's perfectly within the public interest, yeah.
Excellent. I definitely say a water park could be within my interests. Christina's actually come in with another question that's a bit of a doozy, and that's how does community right to buy, how does the process fit with the new opportunities to for compulsory purchase on derelict land?
Nah, the compulsory purchase. It may seem a bit pedantic, but the compulsory purchase on abandoned or neglected, not derelict. There is a different
Yes.
definition for derelict, unfortunately. But essentially, I mean, that we're hoping to introduce that towards the end of the year. But essentially, a community can have both. Remember the part 2 one that we were talking about today is a registration of interest, but that will, if sold, give you the chance to buy it first. The compulsory purchase on abandoned, neglected or detrimental land is just that, is a compulsory purchase. So whether or not the owner chooses to sell, if we accept that application, the community will be buying it from them. Obviously, because it's that, there's a lot of hurdles to get through and bars to beat, high bars to meet because of it's a compulsory purchase, but it does give the opportunity to do that. And effectively, a group can have a registration of interest on a site, decide this is never going to sell on a month of Sundays. It's getting worse in condition. We now think it comes under abandoned and neglected if it didn't already. So therefore, we're going to put in an application under that as well. So they can, in theory, have one sitting and then choose to use the other at a later date.
Okay, that's really interesting. We've got a question in from Emma Galloway, who I think that she's from quite an ambitious development trust. She's saying that as there are a number of buildings that they could be interested in. If they were looking at all of them, would they need to contact the community separately for every building, or it could be a number, or could they kind of ballot them on a number of buildings at the same time?
Well, I mean, the petition that they send into us, the ballot takes place at the purchase point, but the petition, the community interest can come in. You can cover all the buildings, but what's important to think about is the application itself. If those buildings are owned by different people, it can only be one application against one owner. If it's the same owner for several buildings, your application can say, well, we want to buy that. Well, we're interested in X, Y, and Z. Maybe one of the important things to note and to think about for that is that if, for example, there are half a dozen buildings or pieces of land that could meet your community's needs that you've identified, but you only need one of them, what we're quite happy to accept is an application, 6 different applications, one on each, so that if the owner decides to sell one of them, you can trigger that application and withdraw the other 5. Now that might seem like a lot of extra work, but if you've got the same plans for each of the building, the applications are largely the same, so it's as much of a copy and paste exercise. Now we're okay with accepting 6 applications under those circumstances, because we realise that if, for example, if you'd put an application covering all 6 and the owner decides to sell all 6, what you can't do at trigger point as a community is cut down your application, if you like. You can't say, oh, well, all right, you're selling all 6, well, we only want 1. If he decides to sell one of the 6, you can buy that. If he then decides to sell a second one at a later date, you can decide to buy that as well, or decide, well, actually, we're not going to bother, in which case the rest of your application falls. You don't get an option over the other ones. So if there's multiple areas, it's in all senses, it's probably best to try and do different applications over each. That's not to say you can't have more than one application triggered and running at the same time if he decides to sell them all, but it gives you a bit more flexibility in just how you want to use it. If you want all 6 and that's all it'll do, then by all means, register on all 6 in a single application.
From the sounds of it, in that situation, it'd be best for the community group to come and talk to you quite early on to have a chat about what the best way forward.
We'll tell you what the best option. Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. Perfect. I happen to know that the team are all very friendly, so please do get in contact with them. We've got a question in again about community interest companies. Has the legislation changed regarding that registering an interest? They were saying that they believe that their community interest company registered an interest a few years ago on a different building.
It wouldn't be a community interest company. They would have formed as a company limited by guarantee, but it was a few years ago that it was under right to buy. Community interest companies, that's the format that the group is in at the moment. They are not eligible. There has to be one of the 3 types. They can change to one of the 3 types, or they can form a sub-group, if you like, or a sort of organisation, which is one of the formal types. Because I do know that communities quite often form several different groups. One will maybe look at the renewable side of things. One will look at the village hall side of things. One will look at the business park or the environment park or whatever. So you can set up different companies under an umbrella, but each of the individual ones has to be a company in its own right, either registered companies house, Oscar, or the FCA, depending on which format you pick. But still, again, community interest companies aren't eligible for right to buy.
Okay, so probably another case where talking to your team quite early doors would be quite a good thing to do. Grand. We've had a question in from Gordon who is saying, if the property includes a business, for example a pub or a hotel, can the business value be included, or would it just be the land, bricks and mortar?
No, the business value would be included in that full valuation because it's a current ongoing business. We also take into account any planning permissions that are on it, not necessarily what the business plans are for it, but we do take into account planning permissions in the value, and that's taken into account by the district valuer in their valuation. Of course, what they don't necessarily take into account is future plans. So say if it was a viable pub but you wanted to turn it to something else, the value of the building is based on what it is now, not on what it can be.
Okay, dog. We've got Morven coming in again, where she's talking about the situation where a group have maybe started the community right to buy process, and the owner hears about it. The owner hears about the potential community right to buy and decides to put it on the market as soon as possible. Would the initial steps, i.e. the discussion at board level, the conversations with the owner and initial meetings, be enough evidence to enable a late application?
Yes, as long as those were related to talking about purchasing the asset. If you were just discussing the owner, his plans for it or their plans for it, and maybe getting involved in developing the plans but not looking at purchasing, then not necessarily. So the earlier steps and the relevant work has to be relevant to purchasing the asset. One thing to maybe add on that is it doesn't necessarily have to be the community group that's put in the application that's done that work. So for example, if your community council was looking at buying a piece of land, not that necessarily can own land, but if they were looking at getting hold of a piece of land from an owner, then decided, well, it's not for us to own it, it's maybe for the community to own it, and then they passed it on to you, the work that they'd done beforehand can count as relevant as well, because it was with the aim of your community group purchasing the land. So as long as it's to do with purchasing the land in some way, shape or form, then we will look at that evidence and it can be acceptable.
Okay, so if they're also within the community, I suppose, so that would count towards it in that way too. Okay, we've got a question from John McDonald, one of my colleagues. Could you please run over the leasing of a property on which a group has a community right to buy? Would that limit the length of a lease or potential lease on the building?
No, not at all. I mean, if they have, for example, a 10-year lease on a property and you've got a right to buy on it, that's obviously going to run for 5 and you can then re-register. That lease is still in place. The right to buy is only triggered if they then sell. So they can continue the lease, because at the end of the day, it's still the same owner. It's only when they look to change the owner of the property that the right to buy is triggered. So just by leasing it to somebody else, that doesn't change that.
Okay. We're coming to the end of the questions. I've got one last one here, which is, unless someone gets in between this time, and that's how many registrations could one community group potentially have at any one time? Is there a limit?
Oh, as many as you like. I think 9's a record.
Okay, so if anyone
again, but that was because there was lots of different areas of land which they thought might have been eligible, and rather than asking them to pick and choose one at the time of application, they thought, well, any of these will do. So if any of them come up for sale, we'll take. We'd be happy to take any of these. So they put in 9 different registrations covering 9 different areas of land, and I think in the end of the day they triggered 2 out of the 9, and they withdrew the other 7. But okay. No, there is no limit, but it really needs to fit with what you want. For example, I mean, the example we use is if you've got a 100-acre field and you only want 1 acre of that, we're not expecting you to pick which 1 acre you want. Yes, you can put in 100 applications on each of the 1 acres, but you really have to think there really needs, be a little bit more realistic in it than that. But that kind of demonstrates that no, there is no limit to it. It's okay. How much work you want to put in it.
I think 100 applications for one field might be quite hard.
That might sap the will to live slightly, yes.
Okay, we've got one last question. Amanda's just snuck in underneath the barriers. So in the application, it's hard for her particular group to choose between 5.1 and 5.2 because the community has been interested in the land since 2008 and they have spoken to the owner, but there's very little hard evidence of that. the owner put it on the market very quickly and unexpectedly, what avenue do you suggest that their group should go down?
Right, you're now trying to make me memorise what the 5.1 and 5.0. If I remember correctly, 5.1 is about what steps you have taken beforehand, and 5.2 is about if you didn't take any steps, why not? If I remember correctly.
That would fit in context, yep.
Yeah, so essentially it is a question of one or the other. If if you had taken steps before it, then you demonstrate those to us. And as I say, we need to have some sort of proof you've done those, even if it is just an email amongst the people attending to tell them to be there on time. That shows you at least had a meeting. We'll then balance that with whatever the owner says about the content of that meeting or the fact of whether or not it took place. If you don't have any of that evidence, then you haven't taken relevant steps or work as far as we're concerned, in which case that would then be 5.2. And you'd have to tell us why you didn't do that. Now, unfortunately, things like we didn't know doesn't count in terms of reasons for not having taken work. If, however, there were absolutely no indications that it was going to go up for sale and all of a sudden it did, you could point to the fact that, well, nobody knew this was going up for sale, so it was impossible to even think about discussions. But to counteract that, that's why we always say that it's far, far better, wherever possible, for communities to be proactive in this. Start thinking about what you need and what you want. Don't wait for the for sale sign to go up. If you think you need a building or asset to do something within your community, then think about that now. Even though there's no indication that that will be coming up for sale, don't wait till it looks like it's coming up for sale. Decide that you could do with something for that now and identify where that might be and put your registration on that ahead of time. Easier said than done in a lot of cases, I understand that, but that's why we have the late application process. But essentially, you've got to have good reasons to why you haven't done any work at all, and unfortunately just not knowing about it, or we hadn't thought about purchase, we'd only thought about using or whatever, it doesn't really quite meet that requirement.
Okay, so quite a clear answer. I'd suggest that they also possibly get in contact with the team. Well, your team.
Oh yeah,
Dave.
you can do, and we'll let you know, which one would be the best option for that. Yeah.
Okay. That's actually taken us to the end of our questions. Unless anyone manages to sneak in another wee one right before the end, I'd like to thank Dave. I think that was a really good rundown of Community Right to Buy. Please do get in contact with the team. Their details are in front of your face. And again, do look at the handouts, which are on your right-hand side. They're developed between Highlands Enterprise and DTAS or COS, with the expertise of the Community Right to Buy team or the Community Land team thrown in there too. They're quite a nice visual representation. This webinar has been recorded, so I will be sending it around with links. So if you missed a wee bit, don't worry about that. And other than that, I'd just like to thank Dave and wish everyone a happy weekend.
Okay. Bye.
Bye, folks.